Hello. Hello, everybody. It's my honour to welcome you today to the Department of Engineering. My name's Emma. I work in the library here. I'm just going to run over a couple of housekeeping things. Sorry. This is an X Factor. I'm not used to it. Right. So, fire exits. We have fire exits, but there's no planned fire drill today, so if the alarm goes off, there is in fact a fire. Please make sure you know where your exits are, because they may be behind you. Engineering is a bit of a rabbit warren. I will try and explain where stuff is. Keynotes and lightning talks will all happen here. If in doubt, come back here. Parallel sessions are in LR5 and LR6, which are upstairs on the floor of the library, which is where the coke room is. LT1 and 2 are in the Ingalls building, which is across the courtyard. The quickest way is across the courtyard, but you'd have to go outside. So if you don't want to go outside, please go up to the library and follow the directions from there. It requires going up 2 flights of stairs, going down 2 flights of stairs, but you won't have to go outside. All food can be found in LR4, which is the room where you registered. And that will be there in the times of which it is stated. Other things. Posters. Posters are all up in the library. Please go up and see the posters. We have some very good ones this year. Feel free to take up your coffee, tea, sandwich, Danish, whatever, and go and look at the posters. We also have a quiet area up there. I think it's called the Castle of Reflection. If you feel that you need to get away from the hustle and bustle of the conference. Toilets. The nearest toilets to here are back out into the reception and down the stairs. If you're over in the Ingalls building, there is one on the corridor there. They're kind of all over the place. Look for them, but there's always one in the basement if you need it. We are attempting to record the keynote speakers today. I'm currently being filmed. If it works, we will release it to you all. If it doesn't, we won't. But just to warn you that it is being recorded, if you don't want to be filmed, do not come on the stage. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome everyone to this year's Cambridge Libraries Conference. I'm Tom Sykes. I'm one of the co-chairs of the organising committee, and I'm also the librarian at Magdalen College Library. So I'm going to be very brief and not take up any time, and just say that we've got Professor Graham Virgo, Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Education, who's kindly agreed to do our introduction to the conference, and then our first keynote speaker will follow straight on, and that's Dr Jeremy Knox from the University of Edinburgh. So I will pass you straight over to Graham Virgo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here this morning at the start of this conference, and it looks like a really interesting programme that you have before you today. In my capacity as Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Education, I have responsibility for all sorts of things in the university, whether it's undergraduate education, postgraduate education, part-time students, sport, and also libraries and library services, in that I am chair of the University Library Syndicate. And it is particularly in that capacity that I am delighted to be here this morning. We live in very interesting times. Regardless of what is happening outside of this university, there are all sorts of really interesting things happening within the university, and that are going to be happening in the course of this year. We have, for example, in October, a new Vice-Chancellor arriving. As I am reliably informed, the very first Vice-Chancellor of this university to come from outside of the United Kingdom. He comes from Canada. We also have a new university librarian starting after Easter. And I do just want to record my thanks to all of you who have been doing so much to help the university library, affiliate libraries, and all library services to get through this interregnum period, ready for the arrival of the new university librarian. But also, we live in interesting times because of issues and debates that are ongoing relating to what a university actually is, what are we doing, and actually what are all of you doing? What is the point of what you are here for and what you're doing? There are some really existential questions arising at the moment about the nature of universities. And let me give you two examples. There is a bill going through Parliament at the moment called the Higher Education and Research Bill. That is a very long bill which has some profound new powers to expand the higher education sector for all sorts of new providers. But at no point in that bill is there an attempt to define what a university is and when an institution can justifiably call itself a university. That may change, however. In debates that are taking place in the House of Lords next week, there are going to be peers in the House of Lords who are arguing that there should, for the very first time, be a definition of what a university is. And therefore, there will be a lot of discussion in the media about what we think a university is. How would you define a university? Well, it's a place for research. It's a place for teaching. It's a place for learning. But there is more to it than that, surely. Indeed, only on Tuesday, the government announced an amendment to the bill to recognise that knowledge exchange is an important feature of a university. That's a very significant development relevant to all of you. Also, I and others have been arguing that the definition of a university should have a responsibility for all those working within the university to have responsibility to be a critic of government and of policy decisions that we don't like, and to act as the conscience of society. And I'm hopeful that that phrase, critic and conscience, is something that we will see a lot more, because I regard that as a really important part of what a university stands for. Again, something that affects all of us. But there is another recent development, perhaps a bit closer to home and closer particularly to my own portfolio of education in the university, and that is the Teaching Excellence Framework. And I'm sure you've all heard something about the Teaching Excellence Framework. In December, this university agreed that it will participate in the second year of the TEF. And that will mean that by the end of this month, we have to submit a 15-page document identifying what we consider to mark and characterize teaching excellence in this institution. And I've been involved in this draft, and I've seen a number of iterations, but in each iteration of this draft, the role of the libraries and library services has been highlighted. And I hope you welcome that and support that. But that is a really important message that this university is saying, that we consider our educational experience to be exceptional. And the role of libraries and those who provide the library services, however defined, have a really important part to play in that submission and in what we say is educational excellence here. Now, when I first thought about what I was going to say to you in my few moments this morning, I did start by thinking perhaps I should answer that question that is up there. Well, not necessarily are you a library superhero, but what is a library superhero? I think that is for you to reflect on and to consider during this day. I suppose a library superhero must have superpowers, and certainly my knowledge of those working in libraries and library services, you have all sorts of superpowers that I certainly do not have. But whether or not you are a library superhero and wish to characterize yourself as a superhero, your roles are really significant to this university. As I say, that is reflected in our claims for teaching excellence. Thank you for everything you have done and are continuing to do, and I hope you have a productive and enjoyable day. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Well, first of all, to say thank you to the conference organizers, to Diana, Simon, and Tom for hosting me. It's a great privilege to be here this morning and to talk to you about some of my ideas around technology. I noticed on the program this morning that the title of my talk wasn't present. Well, here it is. Digital heroics, and that should reveal to you that what I want to talk about this morning is technology. I was very pleased to hear in the introduction some thoughts about the definition of the university as we move into 2017, because I think technology is one of the things that plays an important role in how that might come about, and I'll say a little bit more about that during the talk. My version of digital heroics that I want to talk about this morning will hopefully say something about some key challenges that I think we face in universities. I've got two of them in the title there, openness and analytics, but actually I want to talk about a third as well, automation. Openness, analytics, and automation, and I'll elaborate on some of those shortly. So, my name is Dr. Jeremy Knox. I work at the relatively new Centre for Research in Digital Education at the University of Edinburgh, the logo of which is on the bottom left of the slide there. We formally launched the centre just last year with 4 different strands: digital cultures, learning analytics, policy, and children in technology. To characterize the work that I and my colleagues do in that centre, it would be to say that we teach and research around the questions around how technology is changing the educational institution and the practices and the cultures of teaching and learning that are involved in that. And importantly, to take a critical stance. I think that's one way you could characterize my work, It's opening critical questions about technology in education. What I find in this field is that there's a lot of evangelism about technology from people who work in this area, and I think critical questions are really needed, and those are the things that relate to the ways we define what the university is and how we would like to use technology in that space. Given that this is a conference with a theme of superheroes, who else could I choose as my superhero for this morning but Iron Man? If you're not familiar with Iron Man, he is a superhero who uses a suit of technology through which he engages in his superhero antics, a suit that has various gadgets and things to help him fly and defeat his enemies and that sort of thing. I've just remembered that I need to grab my notes, which are down here. Otherwise I'll forget all the important things that I need to say about Iron Man. Of course, I could have had a nice picture of from the film. There have been a number of recent films about Iron Man, but given that I'm true to using Creative Commons images, this was the one I found on the Creative Commons image search with acknowledgement there. Now, what I want to suggest to you this morning, and one of the reasons why I've chosen Iron Man, is not just because he is a superhero that uses technology, and technology is the thing I want to talk about today. I want to use Iron Man to try and get across the idea of a new kind of superhero. Now, the first apology of the morning will be to any real comic book fans out there, because I don't know all that much about Iron Man or about Marvel in general, but my idea about him is that he does present a new kind of superhero in these three ways. Iron Man doesn't have an innate superpower. It is technology, and it is his inventiveness with technology that is his superpower. He uses technology to overcome obstacles rather than having some kind of innate power. That's an idea I'm going to work with this morning. Also, there is less of an alter ego with Iron Man. If we look at some of the traditional superheroes, Superman, Batman, we have Clark Kent and Bruce Wayne becoming these other characters. Particularly if you look at the new films of Iron Man, I think he is a character who doesn't necessarily change when he puts on his suit of technology. He remains the same kind of person. He remains Tony Stark. And if you've seen those films, you'll know that Tony Stark is a bit of a flawed character, which is my third character trait there. He's a playboy. He's a millionaire, billionaire, and he's a weapons manufacturer. And if you've seen those films, you'll know that he turns to fighting bad weapons dealing, albeit using the technology that he has developed, his clever gadgets that he has clearly developed through his own wealth and his own gains from developing weapons. So in that way, he's a kind of flawed superhero. So I want to translate those three characteristics: the no innate superpower. And I need this one into an important character trait of creativity. Rather than some innate ability, it's our creativity and our ingenuity with technology that will win the day. In terms of not having an alter ego, I think there's increasingly less of a separation between our digital and our real lives. Technology is becoming woven into the everyday fabric of our lives. So what I mean by mundanity here is the everyday. And I think a great example of that are the smartphones and mobile devices that people increasingly carry with them. Gone are the days that we log into a large computer with a CRT monitor and we go into the virtual world of the web. We are increasingly using digital spaces, going online and coming offline throughout the day. The lines between being online and offline are becoming increasingly blurred. I saw a fantastic piece of artwork by a student at Edinburgh College of Art not so long ago, and it was a piece of, I guess, performative work about her smartphone. And what she did was hack into her smartphone and which enabled her to print out all of the data that is constantly streaming out of her device. And if you have a smartphone, whether you're using it or not, data will be coming in and out of that phone all the time. And this artwork involves her printing out the data onto A4 sheets of paper and carrying around an increasingly larger pile of paper throughout the day, demonstrating, very cleverly, turning that invisible data into a physical object and demonstrating the way that that data accumulates throughout the day. And she had to carry this enormous amount of paper around with her. So not only is technology, our going online, increasingly becoming blurred with our everyday offline lives, but we are also, in our everyday, being surrounded by data. So acknowledging the everydayness of data, I think, is an important character trait for our superhero with technology. And finally, this idea of a flawed character. I mentioned with Iron Man and Tony Stark that he's a bit of a flawed character. He deals in weapons, he makes a fortune, but then he also uses that money to fight the bad guys. With my critical hat on for digital technology, I want to suggest complicity. In the digital, we are always, and increasingly so, complicit with the corporate interests of social media and the kind of mass surveillance of the web. And with that example of the smartphone, that's precisely what the companies who provide these devices to us do, is constantly track and gather data from these devices. So to use the digital, to be in the digital space, is one which is not so easily separated from surveillance and the interests of the organizations who provide these devices. So despite what the Silicon Valley technophiles would have us believe, there is no digital utopia. And that's the critical point that we need to be cognizant of as we work in the digital. So I'm going to try and talk about what I think are these positive character traits as I work through and talk about what I think are some of the key challenges for us when we use technology in our work in the institution. I think we're missing a little bit of the text there, but I can explain that. And the three areas that I want to open up and talk about this morning are openness, analytics, and automation. And I'm going to do that by talking about 3 or 4 projects, recent projects, that I've been working at in the Centre for Research in Digital Education at the University of Edinburgh. And hopefully those examples, while they are educational examples and within a school of education, hopefully I can pick up on the broader themes of openness, analytics, and automation in them, which will make them relevant to a wider institutional interest. So what I mean by openness, first of all, is open access, open data, open badging, open government. Open seemed to be the word of 2016. Open washing was an interesting critical term that some used to criticize the way that lots of organizations decided to tag on the word open to lots of things that they did to make it sound good. Openness is a term that seems to have this sheen of positivity about it. If we work in the open, this is naturally something good. But it's a critical question for us in the institution. What does openness mean for the ways we define what a university does? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Secondly, analytics. What I mean by that is the use of big data, the computational processing of large data sets. What that means for how we come to be able to understand the behavior and activities of our students and perhaps also our faculty at institutions. What are the critical questions and what are the creative ways that we can work with analytics? And lastly, automation. And the subtitle of that heading there is Assessment, Teaching, Efficiency, and the Non-Human. So what I mean by automation is the idea of using technology to fulfill the task that humans would normally do. Something, of course, that is much wider than education, but something which, through the use of technology, is increasingly coming into educational practices. Turnitin is a well-known example of plagiarism detection software that automatically decides whether a piece of work is copied from another source. Increasingly, aspects of teaching are becoming automated, and I'm going to talk about a specific example of that. So again, what are the creative and what are the critical approaches that we can take to rethinking creatively about the idea of efficiency and about the idea of working with the non-human, working with software agents in our educational practice. So, of course, being somebody who works in digital education, talking about a theme of openness, I couldn't escape talking about MOOCs. I'm not sure how many of you have come across that term before. If you work in education and technology at all, you probably haven't been able to escape it over the past couple of years. And what we're looking at on the slide here are a number of headlines from media sources, using words like revolution and phrases like the beginning of the end for traditional higher education, the future of education. What these articles were collected around the year 2013, 2014, at the moment when the MOOC was being hyped across the media as this transformational piece of technology for the higher education sector. And of course, what I mean when I talk about MOOC, just for those people who haven't come across the term, it's an acronym for Massive Open Online Course. Massive meaning very high enrollment numbers. The first MOOC, which was offered by Stanford University on artificial intelligence, I think had over 100,000 enrollees, and many since have had in the tens of thousands. Open means free access. Open is actually a very interesting part of the MOOC acronym, and there's lots of different ways we can come at understanding how they are open, but principally they are courses which offer free access to resources. You don't have to be a student of a university, you don't have to pay any money, but you can access these resources normally produced by a university for free. Openness also, of course, means that there's no mandatory qualifications to get in to have a look at those resources. There's no prerequisite. And of course, the other O, we are talking about courses that are fully online, and that's another big thing that's been a big challenge for universities, is to think about how they can offer the wonderful educational work they do without students having to attend the physical campus. And of course, MOOCs have propelled the idea of online education into the mainstream, despite people working in that area for a long time. And the C of MOOC is also important because these are courses, and this is the thing that makes MOOCs different from previous work in the open education movement. These are courses with a beginning and an end point and at some form of assessment. So they are structured. Of course, for those of you who have experienced a MOOC, you'll know that tutoring and support is light touch. I'm going to say a little bit more about teaching in the context of the MOOC shortly. They are really entry-level courses. They are not formal degree programs. And one way we can think about them is giving members of the public, people who are not students of universities, access, a window to the kinds of things that happen at universities, the kind of teaching that happens. And of course, the other big question that I always get asked when I talk about MOOCs is the issue of university credit. To date, there have only been a few small experiments with university credit. The majority of MOOCs only offer bespoke certificates of completion. Of course, this is a big thing that various organizations are trying to move forward with. But at the moment, MOOCs don't really offer any substantial university credit. So the reason why I'm talking about MOOCs is that Edinburgh were one of the first UK universities to get involved in this MOOC scene around 2012, 2013, and we're seeing our principal there signing the contract with the US-based organization Coursera. On the left there is Daphne Koller, who was a machine learning professor at Stanford and one of the people who started the organization Coursera. Coursera are a for-profit organization that are affiliated with a number of universities, and Edinburgh was, I think, the first UK one to sign with them. On the right-hand side, left-hand side of the slide are a number of the institutional reasons for Edinburgh getting involved: reputational, an interest in technology, trying to be seen to be at the cutting edge of experimentation. But importantly, at the bottom there in the blue, I don't think the university really ever took the question seriously whether MOOCs were really going to replace on-campus taught degrees. I think from the beginning there was the idea that they would be approached as a different educational space, not something that would challenge the core work that the university does. On the right-hand side of the slide are the first 6 MOOCs offered by the university, and the third one from the bottom is the one I'm going to talk about shortly, which is the one I was involved in designing and teaching, e-learning and digital cultures, along with my colleagues who I should acknowledge here as well, Professor Sean Bain, Dr. Hamish MacLeod, Dr. Jem Ross, and Dr. Christine Sinclair. So MOOCs really, as I said previously, really propelled the idea of online education into the mainstream. And I think this slide demonstrates that. Very interestingly, this is Daphne Koller, who we saw on the previous slide, talking about her organization, Coursera, with a slide there typically entitled The Online Revolution. And she's speaking at the G8 Innovation Conference in the UK, which I think was in 2015. Really demonstrating the high level of interest, national policy kind of interest in MOOCs at that time. And this really generated lots of discussion around whether MOOCs were going to transform the higher education landscape. This is a graph that was produced by the Chronicle of Higher Education in early 2016, showing the number of MOOCs being offered. And you can see the steady increase there, predicting 3,800 by February 2016. I'm sure that has been surpassed by now. So despite the idea that there certainly was some hyperbole around MOOCs at the beginning, that kind of statistic might indicate that they are not going away so quickly. However, of course, my point in talking about MOOCs is to try and raise some critical perspectives, and particularly about this idea of openness. And I think this is the point that makes the theme of openness relevant to wider areas. I think with increasing openness comes a diminishing of importance given to expertise, to curation, and specifically to education and teaching, which is the thing I'm going to talk about. The hierarchy of the institution is often uncritically contrasted with a horizontalized, from the ground up kind of approach. And this is the opposition I've tried to convey on this slide. An idea of horizontal work over the hierarchy of the institution, bottom up over top down, the wisdom of the crowd over expertise, learning over education. If anyone is familiar with the work of Professor Hert Biester, he has written very clearly and lucidly on what he terms the learnification of education, the idea that we structure everything around the notion of a self-directing learner. And what that does is deprivilege the idea of teaching and the idea of education as a profession. Self-direction over teaching. These are the things that I think are very often embedded in the way that openness and things like MOOCs are promoted. So it's not necessarily the idea of self-direction or learning that is a problem, but it's often the opposition in which it is conveyed. So the critical point I want to make is we need some middle ground. Now, if anybody has had the joy of experiencing a MOOC, this is the kind of screen that you might have seen. This was, in fact, a fantastically engaging course called Fantasy and Science Fiction. It was one of the early MOOCs from the University of Michigan. But what that screen shows is the primary content in these courses were video lectures. This one from Professor Eric Rabkin, head and shoulders shot of a 12-minute lecture. So typically this is the kind of thing you would see, and video lectures would be interspersed with multiple choice quizzes, that sort of thing. Here's another example from Wesleyan University. This is actually the Provost of Wesleyan University, Michael Roth. Again, another excellent MOOC on the modern and the postmodern. Now, one might think that the video lecture, the primary means of content in the MOOC, brings teaching to the fore. However, what I want to suggest here is that it does precisely the opposite. It devalues teaching by presenting a superficial notion of pedagogy within the institution. These are pre-recorded videos. There's no real means for interaction with the audience. Students are largely left to self-direct through the course of learning. And self-direction and autonomy is really the foundation of the way that MOOCs are promoted. And that leads me on to talking about the MOOC that I was involved in designing and teaching. It was called Elearning in Digital Cultures. We delivered 3 instances of the same course across 2013 and 2014 on the Coursera platform. And what we're looking at here is a typical example of one of the resources pages of the course. And in the design of that course, we wanted to resist the idea of doing video lectures. We felt that was quite a superficial idea of what teaching might be. And instead of including videos of ourselves talking, we decided to embed public domain videos and use those as the resources of the course. So what we're seeing here are a number of animations, film shorts, content of that sort, freely available on the web. And we decided to curate, put these resources together, and offer them as the primary content. In addition, of course, we provided publicly accessible readings for students to engage with as well. The primary activity that we wanted students to do on the course was blog about that experience, engage in the readings, watch the videos, try to pick up themes between the two, and write about the experience, and engage in conversation with each other about the things that they were perceiving in the videos and in the readings. This is a website that we called the Edc Mooc News. That was the acronym for our MOOC, Edc Mooc. And this was a blog page which brought together all the student blogs into one place. I think that the slide in a moment shows the number of blog posts we had, but students were blogging all over the public web on free services like WordPress and Blogger, and this service was bringing all those blogs together in one space where teachers and students could view them easily. If anyone is interested in the technical means through which we did that, I can explain that a bit later. So while that might seem like a clear example of self-direction, we're not appearing as teachers, and we are asking students to look at the resources themselves and discuss them amongst themselves. While that might appear like we are promoting self-direction, I want to argue almost the opposite. We were all heavily involved in teaching the MOOC. The video and readings were carefully chosen and sequenced. Our pedagogy was in the design of the course. And we were, of course, also present in discussion forums with students. We were commenting on their blogs. We were arranged online video conferencing and that sort of thing. And in fact, the reason we only did 3 instances of the MOOC is we were all shattered after doing it because it took up a huge amount of time, huge amount of commitment. And I want to sort of suggest that that amount of commitment is a lot more than pre-recording a video, uploading it to the website, and letting it run without your presence. Teacher presence is the interesting theme that I'm trying to bring up here. Is a teacher more present in a pre-recorded video, or are they more present behind the scenes in this kind of course arrangement? In terms of the spaces of the course, these numbers show some of the spread of student participation. In the large discussion forum within the Coursera site, we had around 8,000 posts, 4,700 comments. Students were using social media, they were tweeting, had around 700 tweets a day related to the course content, students discussing resources, communicating with each other. They also independently set up social media pages on Facebook and so on. Okay, coming back to my heroic character traits. What am I trying to say here? Creativity. There are other ways of teaching than the video lecture if we are interested in this online open space of education. There are creative ways of teaching that don't uncritically assume an opposition between teaching and self-direction. The wisdom of the crowd on the one hand and expertise on the other. Those two things can work together. What am I saying about the everyday, the mundanity of using technology? MOOCs, despite their flaws, have elevated online education into the mainstream, perhaps into the everyday of higher education. Do we need to respond to that? Knowledge exchange was mentioned in the excellent introduction this morning. MOOCs might be one interesting way of thinking about making public what we do in universities to a great extent. Importantly, for the design of our course, for using social media in the way that we did, for using public spaces, fostering an engagement with the web itself, blogs, discussion forums, social media, that might be one way to approach meaningful kinds of learning at scale, rather than passively listening to the superhero professor pre-recorded. Indeed, the video lecture renders the professor rather inaccessible, rather distanced, given that it's pre-recorded in nature. My colleague, or actually who's just retired, Professor Jeff Hayward at Edinburgh, has a marvelous quote to describe distance education, and he describes it as 3 rows back in the lecture hall. So distance is something that we can critically think about when we're talking about online education. This is another example of the spread of our course, but it's also an example of the kind of research that people were doing with MOOCs. This is a world map, and it's a heat map visualization, if you're familiar with that. The darker the hue of the color of the nation state, the more individuals from that nation state enrolled in the MOOC. You see a large presence there from North America and the UK. But what this also shows, as well as showing the spread of our students, it also shows the data capture that was happening around this course. I'll come on to that in a second. This is another visualization which shows the number of, this is one that I often use in presentations, shows the number of students enrolled on the 35 MOOCs which Edinburgh currently offer on various different MOOC platforms, FutureLearn, Coursera, and edX, over 2 million, compared with, in one particular year, it's around 32,000 on campus. So there's a positive aspect to that, in the sense that large numbers of people are being exposed to the interesting things that we do at Edinburgh. But also what I'm trying to highlight here is complicity in partnering with edX and Coursera and FutureLearn, which are both for-profit organizations. We are partnering with organizations that are outside of education, that perhaps have different agendas, different educational interests. There are benefits and drawbacks to that. Partnering with these organizations means that we can attract 2 million people, but it also means that we are bound to them and bound to the agendas that they might have. This is a term that I have tried to coin in a couple of publications, data colonialism. If you look at lots of the research that's coming out of MOOCs and the way that these organizations promote themselves, you always seem to find a vision of the globe with points of data emerging across it. And this is something we really have to think about if we are to consider our job in online education and in this online educational space as one of attracting students on a global scale. When we partner with organizations, they almost certainly have an interest in collecting data from those students. And anyone who has signed up to a MOOC, you'll probably have noticed that you are giving away all the data that you supply to those platforms when you do it. Data, as I'll come on to a little bit later in the presentation, has often been described in critical work as the new oil. Silicon Valley social media organizations base their future profits on how much data they can collect. And of course, you will be aware of the well-known phrase about Facebook, that Facebook and other social media isn't free, you pay for it by giving away your data. We can perhaps characterize MOOC platforms and the MOOC organizations in just the same way. Giving away course resources for free, but those students are supplying data to those organizations. So that's one of the key themes that I talk about in my book, which I released last year, Shameless Promotion. I do feel slightly guilty promoting my own book when I do talks, but given that this is an audience of librarians, I feel slightly less guilty because you can always order it for your libraries, and that's a nice way for lots of people to be able to access one book. Okay, so continuing with this theme of data and perhaps data colonialism, I want to talk about the next theme, which is analytics. And what I'm talking about here is the idea of big data, computational analysis of large data sets, which supposedly provide us with new insights about a whole range of disciplines, and particularly the one I want to talk about, of course, education. The famous quote that you might have come across at the top of the slide there is from Chris Anderson, then editor of Wired magazine. And the article was entitled "The End of Theory." And this is a quote that's often brought up in this area. With enough data, the numbers speak for themselves. So bound up in this promotion of analytics and big data is an idea that we're kind of reversing the way that we try to find things out. Rather than beginning with an idea, beginning with theory and seeking to prove it. This idea that when we have huge data sets, when our devices are constantly pumping out data and when our computers are constantly recording all of the activities that we do, when we have all that data, we don't need a theory to understand it. There's enough data for that, for the insights to become apparent. And that's a position which has been heavily critiqued. And a good example of that is the is the quote below from an excellent, very short book called Data Now Big and Better from Tom Ballstorff, who some of you might know as a well-known ethnographer, and Bill Maurer. And they describe this era of big data, which we seem to be in, the promises of big data, as one as an atmosphere of simultaneous hype and legitimate innovation. And I like that quote because it seems to speak to a critical approach. We do need to be critical about the hype of some of the statements, like the first one on the slide, but this is an area of potentially very interesting and creative innovation. And that's hopefully what I want to get across in the project I'm going to talk about. Of course, this idea of analytics has a much wider than just education. But when we talk about big data in education, we tend to center on this term learning analytics. Learning analytics seems to be how we describe this process within education. And the quote on the slide there is from the Society for Learning Analytics Research, which seems to have emerged as the principal organization. And they define it as the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their contexts for the purposes of understanding and optimizing learning and the environment in which it occurs. SOLAR, this organization, are really gaining legitimacy in educational circles. They now have a journal, I think it's called the Journal of Learning Analytics Research, and they have a yearly, very well-attended conference that I've been involved in organizing. The last one was in Edinburgh. I think the next one is in Vancouver. Learning analytics is something that's really appears to be gaining traction in education. How do we see learning analytics as practitioners working in the university, as teachers and as administrators? Well, this is the kind of thing we see. We see the visualization. Visualization is something that I probably don't have time to get into the critique of very broadly. But what they claim to provide are clever ways of seeing data. It's particularly important when we're talking about large data sets, big data. How is an individual able to perceive such large data sets? Well, with simple, easily accessible visualizations like the ones we're looking at on the board. The left one is from a Stanford MOOC on machine learning. I believe that one comes out of the edX platform. And the one on the right is from Blackboard, which is a well-known learning management piece of software which lots of institutions are using. Dials, pie charts, bar graphs, these are the sorts of things that we as practitioners in institutions are being shown to convey the insights that big data and learning analytics are supposedly showing us. Visualization, I think, is a really good example of the gap that I want to try and explain this morning between data and analytics itself and the response and the kind of action that we as practitioners tend to be encouraged to do. If one reads the learning analytics literature, one often comes across phrases like actionable intelligence, data-driven decision-making, and describing learning analytics as fundamentally an interventionist science. Yet the intervention and the action appears to come and be encouraged to happen in a different space from the analytics themselves. Teachers, students, and administrators are encouraged to take action when they look at visualizations like this. And the process of analytics and the work of this emerging figure of the data scientist, who's the sort of high priest of the big data era, happens in a black-boxed, inaccessible area. So that's the critical point that I want to make about learning analytics. And the project that we piloted last year at the University of Edinburgh is one that is trying to bridge that gap, trying to open up the black box of learning analytics and trying to look underneath the hood of visualizations like that, and importantly, trying to get students involved in that process. So it was a project that we designed to intervene in learning analytics, to bring learning analytics into the processes and activities of teaching and learning. It was a project that asked these questions. How can university teaching teams develop critical and participatory approaches to educational data analysis? How can we develop ways of involving students as research partners and active participants in their own data collection? Because of course, analytics is something that seems to be thoroughly institutional, something that we do to students rather than necessarily involve them in it. And importantly, given that our students are increasingly using technology in their everyday lives, how do we foster a critical understanding of what this means for them, not only in the institution, but in their daily lives of giving away their data and having their data analyzed by organizations. So this was a very small-scale pilot project. It ran for a year, and we are hopefully being able to continue with it this year. It was called the Learning Analytics Report Card, LARC for short, because we wanted to use the idea of playing with data. It's a piece of software that captures data for an individual student's course-related activity within the learning management system that a particular course might be using, and it presents a summary of their academic progress in textual form. One of the things we want to do is critique the idea of the visualization and actually provide some written text in the way that a traditional kind of report card might work. However, rather than this process happening through a sort of hidden and inaccessible institutional kind of data collection and analysis process, what we wanted to do was offer students a way to play with their own data, to choose what was included or excluded and when the report was generated. And what we did was come up with a software interface like this one. The first drop-down box you can see there is one that allows a student to choose the course of study that they're currently on. And the second one, importantly, the particular week they want to look at. So, for example, this student was studying a course called An Introduction to Digital Environments for Learning. And they might choose to look at their report from the week beginning 12th of December. Underneath that, they also were given a number of report themes: attendance, engagement, social interaction, performance, and personal. These were left quite deliberately vague as to what they actually meant, encouraging students to sort of explore what they might mean. So a student could choose some of those themes, click on the button at the bottom of the interface there, which says, OK, report on me, and they would receive something like this on the left-hand side. The bit on the right is just a zoom in on the report itself, just in case you can't read the one on the left. So after selecting the options, the system would look at the data in the learning management system and through some carefully written algorithms and defined variables would produce a paragraph of text that would feed back to that student a little bit about their progress. And this example one from me says, you have usually been extremely social during the course, but this week you interacted less with others than usual. Many of your forum posts have been positive in tone, many have been neutral, and none have been negative. It also says, you really care what others in the class think about you. You're in the middle third of students for social interaction and engagement, but the highest third of students for attendance. And those sentences would be directly related to the themes that the student chose to report on. So importantly, this was a system that we didn't just give to students to use autonomously. What we wanted to do was embed this report card within a course in which the subject of data collection and analysis was brought into critical conversation. So students were encouraged to, I think it's missing from this slide, students can download and archive their reports as PDFs. And what we encouraged students to do in this class was talk about not only how accurate the analytics might be, but also about the effects of experiencing automated reporting on their progress. How would you feel as a student to be told that you really cared what others in the class thought about you? How would you respond to the idea that you were in the middle third of students for social interaction, but in the highest third for attendance? So there's a lot of critical questions surfacing here that I think are important in general when we think about using data analytics to take action. And for us in the institution, whether administrators or teachers, to use the result of data to then go ahead and take action in a class. And those questions aren't just about the accuracy of the data. We could say that the algorithm very accurately put me in the middle third of students for social interaction. But it's a very different point to decide whether you tell a student that, whether that's the appropriate thing to tell a student and the appropriate thing to make them change their behavior in the way you want them to change it. Will telling me I'm in the middle third of students motivate me to raise my game, or will it demotivate me? These are questions that the psychologists have trying to answer for a long time, but questions that are very often not taken into account when learning analytics data is presented back to students. And of course, the classic example for those of you who are aware of software in this area is Course Signals by Purdue University in the US, which rather than having text, simply has a traffic light system. A red mark if you're not on track, a yellow mark if you're on track, and a green mark if you're doing well. Still, the question remains about how useful it is to feed that information back to students. And it's not necessarily true that they will all respond in the same way to that kind of feedback. So research from this project is still emerging. It was a very small scale. But the kinds of things we could do with that, with some of the data emerging, is to look at when students were looking at their own data. This shows the weeks of the course. And if one is interested in finding out how students want to engage with their own data, want to participate in this domain, you could use an analysis like this to work out when they were doing that. It seems to be there's a bit of a trend here of students looking at their data at the beginning of the week. So this was a system that allowed students to generate a new report each week. So Monday would be the day that you'd get your new report. And there's perhaps a bit of a trend there showing reports being generated in the beginning of the week. Another interesting thing that one might do is look at how students compare their reports on any given day with archived reports. So this is a system where you could look back. You could look at this week's report and you could compare that to the previous week and so on. And there's perhaps a bit of a trend there of students looking back at their archived data, perhaps thinking about how their progress is changing throughout the course and thinking about whether the data conveys that accurately or not. Importantly for this project, given that we were interested in fostering critical dialogue with students around the issue of data analytics, student feedback and student discussion was very important. Of course, this is a limited project and it would be difficult to draw definitive conclusions about the capacity for this sort of thing to raise critical awareness, but it may offer some insight. So I think the first quote on the board here really attests to students acknowledging the novelty of this experience, and that was something we found quite a lot. This isn't a sort of system that I've come across in any other institution. But also importantly, the student was acknowledging both the human and the algorithmic input into these reports. They're recognizing that both things fitted into how the report was generating insights. Second quote on the board there starts to raise some of the critical points that students were raising. This student said, "It cannot account for the time I might have been engaging informally with the course, thinking about my dissertation topic, dipping into the course textbook, the level of interest demonstrated in the first assignment." And of course, this is a very important point for learning analytics and people working with data to think about, is what data actually represents a student's learning. Is it merely the activities within a learning management system or some kind of software that the institution provides, or is it somewhere else? Where does the learning happen, and how are we looking in the right places to try and capture that? Third quote on the board there: "Is it possible for a student to be not fully engaged with the course content, but still engaged with reading material from other related sources? How would the student know this from the analytics only?" And again, this raises the point of action. If analytics is to become the everyday of the ways that teachers and administrators work in universities, and we are encouraged to make decisions and take action from that data, are we looking at the right data that allows us to make informed decisions? And trust seemed to be another big theme that came up in talking to students. One student says here, "I need to observe the results over a period of time before I can gain more confidence in the information that it's providing." When we work with students over a term or a semester, we build up trust. They build up trust with us. And that trust allows them to take heed of the kind of feedback that we give them. This is something that the instrumental view and the transactional view of learning analytics perhaps doesn't take into account. Another student: "Should students be made aware of how analytics are functioning and how they might feel as though they are being watched? Or does this only add to the creation of a surveillance culture?" A nice critical point there, but it really highlights this idea of perhaps the necessary hiding of analytics behind the interface. Because of course, if we did tell students how the analytics were generating their report, they would probably quite easily be able to game the system and get fantastic reports every week. And I think the last quote there, referencing HAL, of course, the sinister robot from 2001, signaling this kind of surveillance culture. But it wasn't all negative. Lots of students talked about how it encouraged them to think about their participation, reflect on what they were doing, and the report card was a consciousness-raising kind of process. Again, students were recognizing that it was partial and indicative, as in the second quote there. They were recognizing that this was an automated system. It perhaps wasn't getting everything right, but combining that with feedback from a human tutor, using both those things was perhaps useful. And a nice sort of positive one, I think, in the final one there. So if you want to find a little bit more about the project, there's a couple of publications. The first one from me, which is more some of the ideas about learning analytics, and the second one, a conference proceedings from Amy Assad, who was one of the technical developers of the project. Happy to share these slides later. Coming back to these sort of heroic themes, what am I trying to say with the idea of creativity? Bringing student voice into the practice of data and analytics, a process which is largely institutional, something we do to students rather than involve them in it. And I should say in this project that we did have student representation in the design and development of the software, allowing students to participate in their own data analysis rather than having it done to them by the institution. What about the everyday? Trying to work with students in the day-to-day practices of education, trying to bridge that gap between the hidden work of the data scientists over here and the action that teachers are compelled to take over here. Trying to find some middle ground, trying to bring that process of analytics into the education. Rather than seeking to discover grand insights or predictions about successes and failures, and let's face it, lots of these systems are designed to identify failure. A perspective that is premised on a distancing from educational practice. So in that way, it really tried to make data analytics educational itself, rather than something that's done to education. And what am I saying about this idea of complicity? Well, there is no escaping the fact that the Learning Analytics report card was en masse and veiled surveillance of students. We didn't tell students exactly how it worked. The LARC absolutely worked in this vein. And it still made provocative, sometimes uncomfortable statements, whether they were true or not, about student progress, even where we put objectivity into question. Crucially, however, the LARC wasn't intended to solve the dilemmas of educational data analysis through a straightforward production of a kind of student-centered technology. Rather, the aim was to highlight the entangled and complicit conditions of data capture and surveillance, and to offer ways for students to both experience and reflect upon forms of participation within that process. The purpose was to foreground the ways different aspects of the analytic process are made visible, while others are always necessarily concealed, and to highlight the inherent inscrutability of these kind of algorithmic operations. So, rushing on, as I don't have much time left, I wanted to cover another quick project that we've been working with at Edinburgh under the theme of automation, which was the third challenge that we might have when we are working with technology. And I want to talk about a project called the TeacherBot, which my colleague Sean Bain has written about in that article there. Automation is an area that, when we decided to embark on this project, was one that seemed to be divided in terms of people how responded to it, in terms of how people responded to the idea of automation, either as efficiency, which is an embracing of automation, and what I'm talking about when I talk about automation here is technology, automated systems, software, code, algorithms that are used to automatically perform some kind of action that perhaps we did previously. The evangelism around automation, or certainly the ways that it is normally practiced, seems to be around the idea of efficiency. That's why we create robots, and of course robot deriving from the Eastern European kind of term for worker. Robots and automated systems are things that we develop to decrease the inefficiencies of the ways that humans work. We have that understanding of automation on the one hand, and those, particularly in education, who want to reject the idea of automation and resist it, tend to be in the camp of the human touch. Well, education, particularly education, is something that cannot be reduced to a set of instructions. There's something innately human about it, and that's the thing that we have to preserve. Again, in our vein of critical work at Edinburgh, we wanted to reject this kind of opposition, reject this kind of dualism, and trying to find a critical and a creative middle. And what we wanted to do was create a TeacherBot, an automated teacher agent that worked within our massive open online course, our MOOC, which I described earlier. And we wanted to do something that critically combined our teaching and an automated system. And what we're looking at on the screen here is the interface behind the TeacherBot, which allowed us to program teacherly responses. These various drop-down boxes, which you might not be able to read the text on there, we used a very simple way of building an if-then statement. And if anyone's familiar with programming, you'll understand the idea of if-then. We set a number of conditions, and if those conditions are met, you have a number of responses. we used a very simple idea of a keyword search. The if were the keywords. We defined keywords that students might ask the teacher bot, and in this programming system, if those keywords were discovered in a student question, then we would pre-program on the bottom box there as a predetermined response to those keywords. If anybody is a programmer here, you will notice the simplicity of this system. Really wasn't complex at all. But the thing I want to suggest is that was one of the things that made it creative and interesting. It was a bot that worked within Twitter. If anybody is a user of Twitter, you'll know that there's almost more bots on Twitter than there are human users. It seems to be a big thing at the moment in that particular social media platform. There's lots of automated Twitter accounts which automatically reply and send tweets, that sort of thing. So our teacher bot was a Twitter bot. We built it and we used it within Twitter, and we wanted it to automatically respond to students who are on our MOOC and answer questions. And as I said, it was a fairly simple programming interface, and that was deliberately done because we wanted to embrace the idea that this was a system that might be slightly flawed and that might produce unexpected results. Remember, we were trying to resist the idea of efficiency. We didn't want an automated system that worked entirely towards efficiency, but that opened up pedagogical moments that we couldn't think of in advance. What we're looking at here is an example of a couple of the amusing exchanges, and we're working from the bottom up. This one from a participant saying that they had just attended our Hangout. This was one of our video conferences that we did during the course, and that they were attending a lecture, and they thought this is a wonderful thing. They just attended some of our course, and then they were going to a lecture somewhere at their institution. And the Edc Mooc is our Twitter bot at the top there, which automatically replied, "That sounds wonderful, I wish I was there." Now, we couldn't have really, as teachers, understood the context of that tweet, and nor did the teacher bot. But through its simple ability to pick up on some keywords and to pull in a sentence that we had predefined, it seemed to produce a sort of interesting response to that. This was another one that within the teaching team we found quite amusing. The bottom one here, Matthew is quoting from a book about humanism, which was humanism and post-humanism were some of the theoretical themes that we were talking about during the MOOC. And because this was a simple system and it was searching for keywords within the tweet, I think it picked up on the word helplessly and assumed that this student was in need of help, and decided to put him in my direction. My colleagues laughed at this because they thought it was quite appropriate that I would be the one to help somebody with humanism. But actually, the reason why I have this example is that we couldn't have predicted this kind of interaction happening. But what it did do is actually put me in touch with this student. And I had a few exchanges with him on Twitter, I think, and I looked at his blog. And so in that way, the Twitter bot, while making a mistake, while failing in its efficiency as an automated agent, was actually doing something unpredictable and pedagogically interesting in terms of linking people up. A few more examples here in the time I've got left. These ones are actually taken from that publication that I mentioned earlier, so they're not taken directly from Twitter, but you'll be able to see the student and the bot response there. These work from top down. So this one, a student says there's too much information, and the bot responds to that in terms of this student, I think it was picking up on the phrase too much, and tried to encourage that student to get in touch with other people. And of course, the reason why this is particularly appropriate to this audience is student 7, or rather student 5, saying I was starting to feel silly talking to a robot, had to be another library person to pick that up. Don't know what that says about library people, but I'll leave that up to you to interpret. again, this one was the bot responding to a student which was talking about some of the theoretical ideas in the course to do with philosophy of technology. And that was actually quite a useful exchange. That was one that the bot seemed to be encouraging a useful discussion. Of course, we couldn't have predicted that. And we as teachers, although we had pre-programmed these responses, it's difficult to identify exactly how we were involved in that teaching moment. But if that student was having a conversation with the bot, they were perhaps getting something useful out of it. So what I want to get across here is that the teacher bot explicitly worked with the idea that teacher automation does not have to be about rationalism and instrumentalism. Botty, which is what lots of the students called it, was not intended to solve any productivity deficits in teachers. We weren't thinking that we need to be more efficient in this MOOC, and that's why we're building a bot. And it certainly wasn't meant to replace us as teachers. We still wanted to be the teachers on the course. But rather it was there to explore how an assemblage of teacher-student code, these things that were coming together, non-human automation, human students and teachers, might be pedagogically generative, might come together in ways that produce interesting teaching situations that we couldn't define at the beginning of the course. And in the publication in which you can read a lot more about that, what we try to surface there is the idea of a kind of post-human teaching moment, one that is drawing together the human and the non-human of our work with technology in education. That was at a bit of a breakneck speed. Have I got a little bit more? A little bit more? A little bit. Okay, I'll just quickly introduce another project in a couple of minutes because it might be interesting to some of you. Project called Artcasting, Project PI, Dr Jeremy Knox, colleague of mine at University of Edinburgh, generously funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and this is one that we partnered with Artist Rooms, which is an organisation that owns artwork and moves that artwork around the country, owns it alongside the National Galleries of Scotland. So this is a project that we were looking at education and technology, but more in the cultural sector than in education. These are the two exhibitions that we decided to work with, Artist Rooms, Robert Mapplethorpe in Bowes Museum, County Durham, and Roy Lichtenstein at the Modern in Edinburgh. And what we were trying to do with this project is work with the theory of mobilities, the idea that we can view social systems, institutions, organizations, not in terms of static places, but rather constantly moving and shifting spaces. I'm necessarily moving over that quite quickly to get onto the system we developed, which was a smartphone app. And it was a smartphone app that allowed visitors to those gallery exhibitions to choose an artwork from those exhibitions and send it to somewhere in the world to pin it on a map. So we developed an iPhone and an Android app with a team of developers, and it looked a little bit like this. It had a world map, and you could download this app when you went to the exhibitions, choose an artwork, send it to somewhere in the world, and leave a little message for other people who are using the app to explain why you were sending it to that location. Here's an example of how the app worked. You could choose your David Hockney, a picture of David Hockney by Robert Mapplethorpe, or your Lilies by Roy Lichtenstein. In the second one, you could define a place where you want to send your work, and then in the last one, you could pin it on a map and send it to that location, and give a nice little description about why that you were associating that artwork with a particular place. Some interesting ones here. We had an MEP come to one of our pilots for this project and decided to interpret this Robert Mapplethorpe picture quite interestingly and send it to Brussels. And the description is, this is a reminder to me and my fellow MEPs to look after and welcome people fleeing conflict who are hanging onto life in the most difficult of circumstances. So interestingly, somebody there using our bit of software as a platform to make a statement. Another couple of interesting ones here, a student, a visitor to the exhibition drawing on the relationship between this Mapplethorpe picture and Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, I guess, although I think he gets the date wrong because he sends it to, alongside sending artworks to places, you could send them to particular times as well. This person sends this picture to 1st of January 1602, which I think is actually after Da Vinci died, but he sort of, I think he was sort of getting there, making a connection between this picture and the picture which influenced it. And the other important aspect of this app was that once a person had sent a picture, a Robert Mapplethorpe picture, to a village in Italy, if I had the app on my phone and I was strolling through that location and I had the app open, then the description and the artwork would pop up on my phone. I'd be able to read that description and make that connection. That's what I mean by re-encountering cast. So after that breakneck speed introduction to that project, what I want to finish up is by saying the project was about trying to open up the space of the gallery, trying to use mobility theory, mobile devices, to think beyond the idea of a gallery as an enclosed and as an authentic space where we experience artworks, but rather trying to use the everyday, creatively use the everyday of our technology to allow visitors to those institutions to send them out into the world and to make those connections between the real world and their experience of those artworks. And hopefully those couple of quotes get that across. And there's my book. Oops, how did that get there? Thank you very much. I know I've talked for quite a long time, but thank you very much for listening. I hope it was useful.
Okay, I think we've got time for maybe a couple of questions, but only probably a couple. So if anyone has any comments or questions that they'd desperately like to say. Okay, over here. If you wait for the microphone to come over.
Well, thank you for a very interesting talk. My question really, and this isn't meant rudely, is why are you actually here? Why aren't we watching this on a screen where you're talking to us from Edinburgh, or why haven't you sent us a link via an app or something else where we can just watch this in our own time? Are you suggesting there's something important about you being here? And if you are, can you relate that to the importance of having somebody in a classroom at a particular time talking to a particular group of students who are self-selected to take a class?
Gosh, that's a big one. Yeah, I think what you're interestingly picking up on, I guess, is the MOOC that I was talking about, and this, I suppose, this idea of a fully online education. I must confess I'm somebody who the majority of my teaching is online, and I guess Edinburgh is quite interested in doing that sort of thing, and I do quite enjoy that kind of teaching. Although I am somebody who also values the idea of the campus, values the idea of students coming together in a particular place, being selected to do so, and engaging in a kind of educational experience in that way. I guess all I really say there is that there are opportunities to experiment with that. I don't think there's a definitive. I don't personally believe there's a definitive model for online education that works in every context. Best practice is the kind of thing we hear a lot when we talk about education and technology. I don't think there's any one way of performing a distance education that is the best way. I think we're still working that out, and a physical place where people come together to engage in education is clearly one that still works, and I don't think we've got to a point where we can completely get away from that. I think if you look at the MOOCs that Edinburgh have offered and lots of the other elite institutions around the world who are offering these courses, and most of them are top-tier universities, and indeed the organizations like Coursera and others have, you know, contractual interest in partnering only with elite universities. That this is, MOOCs are a model of education which still need the elite university, they still need the superstar professor, they still need the campus to exist. So very much the idea of revolutionizing education, the idea of the end of the traditional campus is media hyperbole, because the badge of the institution is the very thing that attracts the member of the public to sign up and click on the MOOC. So the interest in looking at a lecture from the University of Michigan is premised upon the University of Michigan being there, and there being rooms and people coming together in that institution. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, other than to say I don't think there is a model of complete distance. I think the two things actually need each other.
So I'm interested, bearing in mind that we can only talk about best practice rather than ideal models. If we wanted to do blended learning options for our postgraduate students, so that if they didn't want to come and sit in a room doing things that they thought they already knew, even though they don't, have you got any advice on how to take a really strong pedagogical approach to setting out the online portion of that blended learning? I'm okay on the in-person teaching. I've had teacher training, but it was before the days of online learning. So.
Okay. When I came to do this talk, a colleague did say to me that, librarians, they ask tough questions. So I am finding this to be true. I quite like the lecture. I mean, I know this is the sort of, not many people in education technology certainly really try to sort of overturn that. And we often hear about the flipped classroom as this idea that rather than the lecture's recorded, and in the part of the education where people come together, something more interactive happens when students have previously watched a lecture. I'm not so sure that that works in all situations. I quite like the idea of listening to expertise. I think that still has a sort of place. But I guess with blended learning, I think it's having plenty of opportunities for students to work with things differently, different spaces, moving out of a usual sort of obsession with the learning management system, something that's locked down, which does everything. You know, it has a discussion forum, it has a calendar, it has a news forum or something like that, rather providing different spaces that students can use, that are perhaps public, that perhaps allow them to work in those sorts of spaces, in which not everything is mandatory, spaces that students, and activities that students can do which aren't necessarily a requirement of the course. Hope that answers your question.
That's fantastic. I think that's all the time we have now for questions. And I just, if we could all thank Jeremy one more time, please. Okay, thank you. So